Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 68 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Columbus Blue Jackets, in which the Sharks have lost 6-5 in overtime. And this was a game that many Sharks fans, and I'm sure many Columbus Blue Jackets fans, had circled on their calendar, because when you're outside of the playoffs, this far outside of the playoffs like these two teams are, your major thing that you are playing for, at least from a fan perspective, is the worst possible record in the league to try and win that or at least get the best odds in the upcoming draft lottery. And in the case of this year, where the draft lottery winner will end up with potentially one of the best prospects since Connor McDavid, Connor Bedard, it's a pretty important one. So both of these teams, at least from a management perspective, definitely not from a player and coach's perspective, as you can see from how this game played out, but from a management perspective, likely wanted to lose this game. Now, if the Blue Jackets had won in regulation, they would find themselves just a single point behind the San Jose Sharks with 2 games in hand on them, making these last 16 games for them and 14 games for the San Jose Sharks incredibly interesting. Had the Sharks won in regulation, they would have been a full 5 points ahead of Columbus, which would have almost certainly locked it down for the Blue Jackets, that last place spot, and made it so that the Sharks' best odds would be finishing second last in the league. In the end, however, we found ourselves somewhere in the middle of that. This game went to overtime, and the Sharks were the losing team here tonight. Thus, the Blue Jackets find themselves just 2 points behind San Jose, still with those very same 2 games in hand, which not the necessarily best outcome from a Sharks perspective, but still an outcome in which that last place spot is still very much up for grabs. Now, before we get into talking about this game, which was very interesting and very fun to watch, let us first mention the bottom 5 of the standings here, because of course this was indeed the Bedard Bowl, so to speak. So like I mentioned, the Blue Jackets last place in the league now with 49 points. The Sharks just 2 points ahead of them with 51. They've played 68 games already on the year, 2 more games than the Blue Jackets have. Meanwhile, you would think that the Sharks would have passed the Blackhawks here tonight, who were also at 50 points coming into the day, but they were actually victorious in their game tonight. And while the Sharks barely managed a point out of their game against the worst team in the league, the Blackhawks managed to beat the best team in the league, the Boston Bruins, by a score of 6-3. Very few teams can say that they have even beaten the Bruins at all this year, and putting up 6 goals is really impressive. So the Blackhawks now a single point ahead of the Sharks in the standings with 52. The Ducks were not in action here tonight, but they were overtime losers a couple of days ago, thus bumping them up to 54 points on the year. We then also have a newcomer on this list, as the Coyotes just keep winning. They're on an absolute tear at this moment. I now think they find themselves 7th last in the league, and it is the Philadelphia Flyers who are currently 5th last in the league, thanks to a Montreal Canadiens win here tonight. 67 games played, 58 points. The Sharks are 7 points clear from the Flyers, so unless the Sharks go on a tear of their own, they should have very little worries about falling anything below at least 4th last, or anything above, so to speak, 4th last in the league. But now let us move on to how this game went, because it was a very exciting game that had so much action, so much interest to it. We had multiple odd man rushes, multiple comebacks, terrible goaltending, which usually makes for an exciting game because you never know which shot could possibly go in. We had first NHL goals of their careers. We had first NHL goals of the season and in a long time. We had a overtime, which always makes games very exciting. It was just an incredibly back and forth, high pace, multi-chance type of game that, it's always fun to watch. A Colorado versus Tampa in the Stanley Cup Finals, 2 absolute titans, behemoth, amazing teams. But sometimes it's also fun to watch, the bottom of the barrel teams kind of duke it out in a low defense, low goaltending type of style. And that's exactly what we got here tonight. This one starts off with the Sharks playing rather well, at least for the first few minutes of the first period. And they'd get the first goal of this game from Barabanov on the power play to make it 1-0. However, that Barabanov goal would be the beginning of a segment of this game that would last last over 20 minutes, in which the Sharks would have a grand total of 0 shots on goal. Meanwhile, the Blue Jackets would rack up 1, 2, 3 goals during that time, 1 in the first period to end that starting frame 1-1, and 2 in the second period to take themselves a 3-1 lead. Now, even though the Sharks did have 0 shots during that time, that doesn't necessarily mean they had 0 chances. In fact, we saw Nico Sturm with a completely wide open net on a wraparound attempt to shoot it right across the crease. And when I say a completely wide open net, I don't mean the goaltender was on the other side and could have potentially dove across to get it. I don't mean that there were 2 defensemen in the net for the Blue Jackets who could have technically made the save, but they're not goaltenders. I mean this was a completely 100% wide open cage that Nico Sturm just missed on, I guess, on this wraparound situation, and so it didn't count as a shot on goal because there was no goal there. And so the Sharks remained still trailing. However, the Sharks' next shot in this game, their 7th shot, ended up being a goal. And that one came from William Eklund, his first of his career. Very exciting to see for sure, as the Sharks then brought it to within 1. However, the Blue Jackets would then regain their 2-goal lead with a goal from Boone Jenner, if I'm not mistaken. And that would make it 4-2. And it looked like that would be the score heading into that third period. However, in not just the last minute, but the last second of this second period, it would be Logan Couture with just a random shot on net to beat the Jackets goaltender and make it 4-3. And like I said, the game did not have particularly great goaltending here, so you never really know when those shots could go in. Now, I have mentioned many times in my reviews, not just this year, but in many years past, that those goals late in the period can be absolutely killer for momentum, and this time it was the Sharks who would get that last goal, so you're expecting them to be able to come out like a house on fire in that third period, and yet, what happens? Well, in the first 2.5 minutes, not only do the Sharks give up a couple of odd man rushes that lead to great chances that Kahkonen has to make some great saves on, but they then also give up a goal to regain the Blue Jackets' 2-goal lead, making it 5-3. However, you're against the worst team in the league, you never say die, and the Sharks managed to claw their way back once more with 2 more goals here, one from Labanc, one from Knyzhov, his first goal in almost 2 full years due to his massively long injuries from the beginning of this season as well as the entirety of last season, and so we are then 5-5. There were some chances for sure in the last few minutes to potentially get the go-ahead goal, but we would not end up in that case, and we then go to overtime. The overtime was kind of a 2-sided coin. At times it was incredibly fast, and at times it was incredibly slow, but what ends up happening is that on a chance for Carlson, Eklund, and Hertl, who are on the ice as a trio at this point, the puck is turned over. All 3 of these players are at the end of their shift, so they don't have the energy to get back, and we end up with a Johnny Gaudreau and Patrick Laine 2-on-0, the 2 best players on the Blue Jackets. They pass it between themselves, boom, 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 and eventually Laine takes the shot, and it's saved by Kahkonen. And at this point, finally, Hertl and Carlson and Eklund have all gotten back defensively, and yet none of them are actually able to stop this pass right back to Gaudreau, who just plants himself in front of the net, who then manages to actually score his 5th point of the night, and the Sharks lose it in overtime. On to the players to talk about. This video is already going on a bit long, so I'll try to make this relatively quick. On the first line of Barabanov, Couture, and Andreas Johnson, I should mention Andreas Johnson because I felt as though he was potentially one of the most effective forwards, if not the most effective forward for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. A lot of chances, actually, for him, and he was potentially a big driving force on this top line, so it's really only 2 games removed from me calling him, not a failure, but a player who had an opportunity to sort of show himself in these games and hadn't yet done so, and suddenly now in these last couple, and especially here tonight, he's been significantly better. Of course, Couture also racking up multiple points here tonight. Barabanov continues to have his nice end of the season, so generally a decent offensive game for the first line. The second line of Hertl, Eklund, and Zetterlund, they definitely had some really, really good looks, but once again, it was Fabian Zetterlund who was just lagging behind the other 2 players on this line, and we even saw David Quinn play into that because by the third period, Zetterlund was actually moved down to the third line, and it was Evgeny Svechnikov, who I wasn't even thinking had that great of a game. He gets bumped up to the second line with Hertl and Eklund, so clearly indeed David Quinn believes that Zetterlund just isn't necessarily working in that situation. But what's interesting is that once Zetterlund was moved to that third line, he actually had a couple of decent looks for himself. So certainly filling in much better in that bottom six compared to in that top six, especially if you consider the Hertl, Eklund, and Zetterlund line the top line on this team. So besides him, Eklund, solid-ish game. Even though he does score that goal, I don't actually think his game was as good as it was in the previous one, but still rather solid. Hertl certainly had a lot of great chances for himself, but nothing amazing. When it comes to the third line of Gregor, Sturm, and technically Svechnikov, they actually had a couple of good looks. Like I mentioned, Sturm had that completely wide open net that he somehow missed out on, but that wasn't the only thing. But it wasn't anything super consistent either from this line. And then, of course, there is the fourth line. So I mentioned earlier that Svechnikov filled in on that trio with Hertl and Eklund, but that only lasted about 2-3 shifts. What we ended up with actually later on in the third period, and we saw multiple times, was Labanc filling in onto that top line or second line or whatever you want to call it, because this sort of weird relationship between David Quinn and Kevin Labanc continues. When he's having a not so good game, he's immediately benched and given 4 minutes. When he's actually having a good game, suddenly he gets tons of ice time, immediately jumped up to that top line, and is looking really good in this situation. So while Labanc has obviously had his struggles this season, when he's not necessarily on his game, he's not much better than like a fourth line forward. But the fact is that he does have a higher ceiling than someone like Zetterlund, at least from what we've seen in the few games Zetterlund has been with the San Jose Sharks. And so when he's on, he can definitely fit in well on this top line. So I would be excited to see if Hertl and Eklund are left with Labanc, and Labanc actually continues to play well, what that line can do in a full 60 minutes against a different team here. And then when it comes to the rest of this fourth line, I mean, there was like a chance for them, but nothing super amazing. It was really only Labanc who really picked it up in that third period, where it definitely shined bright, I guess, so to speak. When it comes to the defensive pairings, we actually had a lot of juggling here. So the Vlasic-Benning pairing that has been together seemingly since the beginning of this entire season, so this is now 68 games in, was finally split up. We saw Vlasic get joined by Knyzhov, Benning get dropped down to be playing with Mario Ferraro, and Derek Pouliot getting promoted up with Erik Karlsson, and that Pouliot-Karlsson duo actually worked exceptionally well. Pouliot was almost the more effective offensive defenseman on this pairing than Karlsson was. Obviously, that's not really the case, but Pouliot actually had a lot of very good chances. It was definitely good to see him in that role and excelling in that role. It kind of reminded me of when Jacob MacDonald was played with Erik Karlsson a few games back, but the difference was that MacDonald is such much more of a risky offensive defenseman than Derek Pouliot. While Pouliot certainly has more of an offensive upside than, let's say, Jacob Middleton or a Jacob Megna or a Radim Shemek or a Ferraro or even a Knyzhov, while that is definitely the case, and so those are the types of defensemen that Karlsson is usually playing with, Pouliot does seem to be a bit more secure than a Jacob MacDonald, which makes this pairing a bit more easy to swallow. It should, of course, be noted that this was a game indeed against the worst team in the league, even if the Sharks are the second worst team in the league, so we can't draw any massive conclusions from this, but it was good to see that pairing working out for sure, and also very interesting to see that Vlasic-Benning pairing finally separated. And then when it comes to the goaltender, we have Kaapo Kähkönen in nets here tonight. Like I said, a game in which there wasn't necessarily great goaltending. That's not to say that Kähkönen didn't make any fantastic saves. There were definitely a lot of very good saves in this game, especially in that first period when the Sharks were just getting caved in. But you take a look at some of these Columbus Blue Jackets goals, you say that he definitely could have had multiple of them. You know, the big one, I guess, would be Kent Johnson's goal early in the second period. That certainly stands out at this point, but this is still a game in which Kähkönen lets in 6 goals, so you can't say it was in any way good. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. They will take on the Seattle Kraken. It was just a couple of weeks ago where the Sharks were on a 7-game road trip, and I believe they lost 6 of those games. The only one that they won was against Seattle, and in dominant fashion with, I believe, 4-0 shutout victory. So we'll see if the Sharks can potentially repeat that performance. Class dismissed.